The guy said to me, Dr. Chapman, we've been married for 33 years, and to be honest with you, the last 20 years have been miserable. He said, we've just been like two people living in the same house trying to be civil.
Everyone I know has gone into marriage intending to make their spouse happy. But why do so many people feel they've failed in that pursuit?
The greatest thing he could have done would have been to walk into the kitchen and said to her, honey, why don't you sit down and rest and let me finish that? Wow, she feels love because now he's speaking her language.
Hello and welcome to For Faith and Family with Dr. Richard Land. I'm Harold Harper, and our guest today says that happiness in marriage is a byproduct of feeling loved. And the reason that people sometimes fail in creating a happy marriage is they never learn how to communicate that love to their spouse.
The husband who makes the conscious choice with God's help, I'm going to give my life away for my wife, and start saying to her, honey, how can I help you? How can I make your life easier? How can I be a better husband? And he begins to do those things, giving his life away to her. Not many women will run away from that man. Chances are she'll start to reciprocate.
Many of you may remember Dr. Gary Chapman because he's been with us before to talk about the 5 love languages. But today he's here to speak particularly to men about learning to speak your wife's love language. Dr. Land?
We're delighted to welcome Dr. Gary Chapman to our program. He's the doctor who tells us about the love languages, and so effectively. And this comes out of a rich experience of his and over 30 years of pastoral ministry, ministering to real couples in real marriages in a real church every day. Gary, welcome to For Faith and Family.
Well, thank you, Richard. It's great to be with you.
Gary, the desire for love in marriage is deeply rooted in our emotional, psychological, spiritual makeup. It's clear that we intuitively understand what God saw in the garden. It's not good for man to be alone. Almost every popular magazine has at least one article in each issue on keeping love alive in marriage. Why is it so difficult for couples to keep the love alive after the wedding?
I think it's because we've done so little in our society to train people on the nature of love. You know, we're big on the in-love experience, and we've made no distinction between that and what I'm calling covenant love. We all go through that stage in which we are literally obsessed with the other person, and it is high. It's the highest high. Well, I think it's the second highest experience we have emotionally. The highest is a conscious awareness of the presence of God. But other than that, I think the in-love experience is probably the highest emotional experience we have. But the movies, the magazines, and most of the literature in our society assumes that it's that kind of passionate, obsessive love that we want to keep alive in a relationship. And the fact is, the nature of love is that is temporary. In fact, we should be thankful that that's temporary. Otherwise, you'd have to close down business, industry, education, church, because you can't get anything done when you're in love. So I think that's a part of it. We haven't taught in our culture very much about the nature of love, that there are stages of love. That's one stage. That's the stage that brings most people to marriage. But once you come down off of that, which you always do, then love has to become intentional. But it still has an emotional dimension, and that's what I'm trying to deal with in my books.
Well, you know, it's interesting you should say that about that's a phase we go through. I remember reading a football magazine several years ago, and the coach said that his quarterback would probably make All-American if he didn't get hurt or fall in love. He said, I've had some football players fall in love, and he said, when they're in love, they're not worth shooting.
Absolutely.
Now, Gary, you have helped tens of thousands of people to discover their love language, because we speak different love languages, don't we, as men and as women and as individuals.
Yeah. And the important thing, I think, is the last part, as individuals. Obviously, there's a difference between men and women, but when it comes to feeling loved emotionally, the important thing is to learn how to communicate love to your spouse, your husband, your wife. It's not so much a gender issue as it is an individual issue. And I think most people agree that the most fundamental emotional need we have is the need to feel loved. And if you're married, the person you would most like to love you is your spouse. As a matter of fact, if you feel loved by your spouse, the whole world looks bright.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't feel loved, the world can begin to look pretty dark, even though you're successful in other areas of life.
You know, you make a point in the book I think that's very important, and that is that we tend, as a spouse, to speak our primary love language, and we get irritated when our spouse doesn't understand what we're saying when we're speaking our love language to them instead of the love language that communicates to them.
Yeah, that's right. You know, here's a guy, for example, and let's say his love language is physical touch, that the thing that really makes him feel loved is when his wife reaches out and touches him, you know. And so he comes home from work, and he wants to express love to his wife. He goes in the kitchen, he starts hugging her and kissing her, and what does she say? Leave me alone. Can't you see I'm busy in here? And he was sincere.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he walks out feeling rejected. The problem was not his sincerity. The problem was he was speaking his own language and not her language. Maybe her language was acts of service. And if so, the greatest thing he could have done would have been to walk into the kitchen and said to her, honey, why don't you sit down and rest and let me finish that? Wow, she feels love because now he's speaking her language. And that's the key.
Yet it's elusive, this clear communication. Why? Why is it so elusive? Is this forever, or has it gotten harder, or has it gotten easier?
Well,
in our culture, in our generations.
Yeah.
I mean, have men become more expressive? Because, you know, there's this old Anglo-Saxon tradition that men don't express emotion. I think that's changed a lot. But still, we have a lot of couples that are speaking over each other's heads and past each other.
Yeah. I think a part of that is, and probably the reason for that is, that we are by nature self-centered, all of us, and the world revolves around me. And in marriage, I enter marriage thinking about, you know, how happy I'm going to be. I have to admit, when I entered marriage, you know, I mean, I wanted my wife to be happy, but I was thinking about how happy I was going to be in the relationship. And so when you enter marriage that way, and you express love in a way that would be meaningful to you, and don't understand that it's not meaningful to them, then you get frustrated. That's why I think a lot of men sit in my office and their wife says, you know, I just feel like he doesn't love me. And he says, what? And he spills off all these things that he's been doing for her, you know, and maybe what she wants is him to sit on the couch with her instead of doing all this stuff. So I think a lot of it is the fact that we're just so self-centered, we assume that whatever works for us will work for the spouse or work for the other person, and that's just not the case.
My parents love to go to cafeterias. It's about the only time I go to cafeterias because my wife would rather go to the dentist than go to a Taking my wife to a cafeteria would not be speaking her love language. Bringing home some fish for her to clean would not be speaking her love language. So I was visiting my parents, and we went to a cafeteria twice.
Mm-hmm.
They love going to cafeterias, and so we're sitting in the cafeteria. And when I go to cafeterias particularly, it's more, I guess, noticeable in cafeterias than in restaurants, in normal restaurants. Couples sitting there eating, and they might as well be sitting there alone.
Mm-hmm.
They have no communication.
Yeah.
They don't even talk to each other.
Yeah, you're absolutely
I
right.
mean, they just sit in there, and they might as well be two people.
Yeah.
If you sawed off half the picture, the other half of the picture, you wouldn't know that there was somebody across the table from them, much less their spouse.
Yeah.
And that is the end result, it seems to me, of not learning the love languages and expressing the love languages of your spouse.
I think that's true. I think what happens is you end up simply two people living in the same house. And if you go out to eat, it's two people out there eating together. You know, conversely, Richard, you know, if you ever noticed in restaurants, you can always tell the difference between dating couples and married couples because dating couples will be talking to each other, and the married couple sits there and eats, you know. And I think none of us want to end up that way. You know, all of us who get married, we'd like to have some warmth in the relationship. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I'm saying in this whole 5 Love Language series is that we can keep emotional love alive in a relationship. I had a couple not long ago. The guy said to me, Dr. Chapman, we've been married for 33 years, and to be honest with you, the last 20 years have been miserable. He said, we've just been like two people living in the same house trying to be civil. And he said, somebody gave me your book, I read it, and he said it was like light bulbs came on. And I gave it to my wife and asked her to read it, and she came back and we discussed it, and I said, do you think it would make any difference in our marriage if we tried this now? And she said, we don't have anything to lose. And he said, we tried it. He said, we said, well, okay, let's speak each other's language once a week and see what happens. He said, if anyone had told me that in 2 months I would have love feelings for her, I would never have believed it. And she said, if anyone had told me I would ever have love feelings for him again, I would have said, no way. She said, but I do.
All right. Let's get down to the big question. How can a man learn to more effectively connect emotionally with his wife? How can he learn to share his feelings of love for her in a way that she will understand?
Well, that's the heart of what I'm trying to do in this edition of the 5 love languages. What I'm saying to men is this. Look, there are 5 basic ways to express love emotionally. And your wife has one of those languages. I call them languages. One of those languages is her primary love language. So if you can discover her primary love language and speak that, she's going to feel loved. And there's 2 or 3 clues on how to discover her love language. One is, what does she complain about? You know, usually we get defensive when our spouse complains about something. But the fact is, if your wife is complaining and saying, we don't ever spend any time together, we're like 2 ships passing in the dark, she's telling you that quality time is her love language and she's not getting it. And she wants it. So if you will listen to the complaints of your wife, you will probably learn her love language. Another clue is, what does your wife request of you most often? If she's saying to you, you know, can we take a walk after dinner? She's asking for quality time. If she says when you're leaving on a trip, honey, be sure and bring me something, she's telling you gifts is her love language. So what does she request of you? And then the third clue is you ask yourself, how does my wife express love to other people? Is she a hugger? If she is, that may be her love language. Is she a verbally affirmer? Is she affirming other people? Then words of affirmation may be her love language. So those are the 3 clues. And then, as I said in the back of the men's edition, we actually give them this profile so they can find their wife's love language.
And their own love language.
And their own love language.
Now, it's important to still speak all 5 love languages: touch, affirmation, gifts, quality time, and service, even though your spouse has a primary love language, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, but the important thing is that you give them heavy doses of the primary love language. You see, the others may not be, they will not be nearly as meaningful if you're not speaking the primary. But if you speak their primary love language, then the others become meaningful. For example, my wife, her love language is acts of service, okay? I vacuum the floors, I wash the dishes, I do those kind of things, and she feels loved. And then if I want to throw in a gift, that's fine. She loves the gift, you know. But if I only gave gifts and I didn't do anything to help her, she wouldn't feel loved, and the gift would be very meaningless, you know. She said, if you love me, you'll do something around here. You know?
Now, one of the questions I think that is difficult for people to get over is, what do you do what do you say to someone who tells you that their spouse's love language is just not comfortable for them to do?
Yeah, and that is often the case, actually. I sometimes say to people,
do you think opposites attract?
More or less, yes. I think
and that complicates the problem, doesn't it?
That's right. Yeah, more times than not. You know, I sometimes say to people, my wife's love language is acts of service. One of the things I do is vacuum floors. Do you think that vacuuming floors comes natural for me? You know, my mother made me vacuum, and in junior high and high school, I said, if I ever get out of here, I'm never going to vacuum floors again. But there's one reason I vacuum floors: love. And if it doesn't come natural for you, it's a greater expression of love. My wife knows every time I vacuum the floor, it's nothing but 100% pure, unadulterated love. And I get credit for the whole thing. So, it is true. For example, I encounter people who say, I'm just not a toucher. I didn't grow up in a touchy-feely family, and now I find out that my spouse's language is physical touching. What am I going to do? And I say, well, if you have 2 hands, put them together, and just imagine getting your spouse in the middle. And if you hug your spouse about 3,000 times, it begins to feel comfortable. But we're really not talking about comfort. We're talking about love. And we can learn to do things that don't come natural for us. In fact, we do that all the time if we're going to continue growing as individuals.
Okay. Let's get into the controversial stuff now. Talk to the men in our audience about many women's need for a love language that involves physical touch that doesn't have an agenda.
Yeah. Well, and I try to make this distinction for the guys that when I say physical touch, I'm not talking sex, even though sex is a dialect of physical touch. But a lot of men, as you know, when you say intimacy or when you say physical touch, they think immediately sex.
And since they're microwaves, not crock pots.
Yes. And so I say to them, in trying to determine, like a lot of men, for example, will say immediately, oh, I know my love language, it's physical touch. And I say, okay, let's think about that. Do you really like it when your wife comes up and you're sitting on the couch and she puts her arm around you on the couch? And maybe he does, maybe he doesn't, And so I go through some other touches. The point is, do you like non-sexual touches? If you find those affirming, then maybe that is your love language. But if the thing that really affirms you is the sexual part of it and these other things don't really mean much to you, then that's probably not your love language.
Now, Gary, I'm sure that you have seen many couples that have come back from the brink of divorce to choose to love once again. What are some of the rewards that a couple can experience if they make that choice and they expend the energy to make it happen? And can the process begin if just one partner is willing?
Well, let me start with the last part of that, because I think the answer is yes. I think one person can influence a spouse. I usually say, we can't control the other person, but we can greatly influence the other person. And understanding the person's love language and speaking it to them unconditionally is one of the most powerful ways of influencing them. In fact, if you speak your spouse's love language over a period of 2 or 3 months and then begin to make requests of them, you may be surprised how they respond positively to your request, because they're feeling your love and they're drawn to you, and they want to do some things for you now. And you can actually teach them to speak your love language even though they've never read the book, because you're speaking their language. Now you're making requests of them and they're responding, and they are speaking your language.
How difficult, Dr. Chapman, is it to speak each other's love language when we're full of hurt, anger, and resentment over past failures?
Well, I think there has to be a tearing down of the wall. A lot of times people will read my book and they say, okay, I'm going to start doing this, and they just start doing it. And the spouse begins to recognize the difference in the behavior, but they're so hurt, there's been so much pain from the past, that they feel like, well, you're just trying to manipulate me by doing these good things, I think that has to be preceded by going to the spouse and saying, look, I haven't been doing well in our marriage. I realize I have not met your needs. I've been very self-centered. Put it in your own words, but a sincere apology to the spouse. And to say, I've got a real desire to be different. I really want to be a better husband to you or a better wife to you. And with God's help, I'm going to try that. Well, they may not be deeply impressed with that kind of apology, but they'll walk away and think about, well, I wonder if that'll be sincere. And then you start speaking their language, and in 3 months they realize, hey, there's been a real change here. But tearing the wall down is important.
Now, Gary, you mentioned choosing to use your spouse's love language to overcome hurts and failures. What about the couples that are dealing with the rebuilding of their relationship after unfaithfulness has taken place in the marriage?
Well, I think the same principle is true. When there's been unfaithfulness, the covenant relationship has been deeply fractured, and there's deep hurt and deep pain in that relationship. I think that, first of all, we have to repent. We have to turn away from that. We have to acknowledge our sin. We have to ask forgiveness. And then it takes time for the trust to grow back. Mm-hmm. They've broken the trust, and it'll take time for the trust to grow back. And that's why I usually say to a guy, for example, who's been unfaithful, look, your wife will probably check up on you. Mm-hmm. She'll probably call and see if you're over there where you said you were going to be. And please don't find that irritating. She's trying to build trust in you. And if she finds that you're doing what you say you're doing, her trust will grow back, mm-hmm. And so that trust can grow back. And in the meantime, we can continue to speak each other's love language, and we are beginning to heal the past. But it takes time for the healing of that deep wound when someone has been unfaithful.
Now, Gary, I'm sure that you have seen many couples that have come back from the brink of divorce to choose to love once again. What are some of the rewards that a couple can experience if they make that choice and they expend the energy to make it happen? And can the process begin if just one partner is willing?
Well, let me start with the last part of that, because I think the answer is yes. I think one person can influence a spouse. I usually say, we can't control the other person, but we can greatly influence the other person. And understanding the person's love language and speaking it to them unconditionally is one of the most powerful ways of influencing them. In fact, if you speak your spouse's love language over a period of 2 or 3 months and then begin to make requests of them, you may be surprised how they respond positively to your request, because they're feeling your love and they're drawn to you, and they want to do some things for you now. And you can actually teach them to speak your love language even though they've never read the book, because you're speaking their language. Now you're making requests of them and they're responding, and they are speaking your language.
You're saying that ideally that the couple would discuss this together.
Yes.
They would both be involved in this. But if one partner is not willing to do that the other partner can still initiate this effort, and often successfully.
Yes, absolutely. And to me, that should bring hope and encouragement to people who are in marriages where they say, well, I've tried, reading, but they won't read a book with me. They won't go to a counselor. They won't talk to the pastor. They won't even talk about us. Mm-hmm. There's still hope, because that person desperately needs love. You can count on it. Your spouse needs love. And if you start speaking their love language, their love tank begins to fill up, and their whole countenance begins to change towards you. Their feelings towards you begin to change. I think the ultimate reward when we get this going both ways is that the couple has what they've always wanted to have, a loving, supporting relationship. Richard, I think that when God instituted marriage, He didn't intend to make us miserable. He intended, in fact, the Bible says 2 are better than 1.
And the 2 became one flesh, and they were naked and unashamed.
Absolutely.
This is the intimacy that God intended for us to have.
Yes.
It became a lot more difficult after the fall.
Absolutely.
But it's still God's intent.
Yeah, and the heart of all of it is the will to love. We love God because God first loved us, and He loved us when we were unlovely. So we may be married to an unlovely spouse, but if we'll reach out, the biblical challenge, we say it a lot, but I don't think many men have gotten it. We're to love our wives like Christ loved the church and gave Himself for it. And the husband who makes the conscious choice, with God's help, I'm going to give my life away for my wife, and start saying to her, honey, how can I help you? How can I make your life easier? How can I be a better husband? And he begins to do those things, giving his life away to her. Not many women will run away from that man. Chances are she'll start to reciprocate. And when she does, you have the biblical ideal. 2 people giving their lives away to each other, supporting each other, and consequently, they can accomplish what God had in mind for them, both as individuals and as a couple.
And there's apart from telling your child that Jesus loves them and Jesus died for them, Jesus has a wonderful plan for their lives, there is no greater gift you can give your child than to model before them a happy marriage, is there?
Absolutely, because when they see that, and they see the mom loving the dad loving the mother, solving their problems in a context of love, and it spills over to the children feel loved, we have prepared them in the best possible way to respond to the love of God as they get old enough to understand that.
Well, thank you so much for being with us on For Faith and Family. We appreciate your taking time from that busy schedule.
Thank you.
And thank you for letting God use you to really give a very powerful weapon in the hands of those who want to live out the biblical understanding of marriage.
Well, thank you. It's good to be with you, and I appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you.
We're making Gary's book, The 5 Love Languages, the men's edition, available in our online bookstore. All you have to do is log on to our website at faithandfamily.com. When you go there, you'll find some additional information about Gary and his ministry. You'll also be able to order many of the other books he's written as well. Our website address again is faithandfamily.com. For Faith and Family is produced in Nashville, Tennessee by the Southern Baptist Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. For more information about our guest and past programs, just visit our website at faithandfamily.com. There you'll find Dr. Land's commentaries, your favorite broadcast, as well as a number of exciting resources for you and your family. And be sure to check out our podcasting feature that will allow you to have the program automatically downloaded to your computer. Also, please drop us a note when you visit. We'd love to hear what you think about today's program. Our website address again is faithandfamily.com. Our team of producers for today's broadcast have been Jeremy Capel, Brandon Bryant, and Amber Chesser. Our executive producer is Matt Hawkins. I'm Harold Harper, and I hope you join us again next time on For Faith and Family with Dr. Richard Land.